Hello, everyone. We will get started shortly. Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's LinkedIn Live webinar. Today, James Leo Lyos and Samy Ghannad and I will discuss the Spring4Shell vulnerability. If you have any question during this webinar, please type them into the comment box in your LinkedIn, and we will bring them up end of the presentation. This 30-minute webinar will be recorded. With that, let's dive into it. So my name is Sule Tatar. I'm the product marketing manager at Arctic Wolf. A little bit about myself. Previously, I worked for multiple cybersecurity companies, and I hold a bachelor degree in computer science and an MBA. We have James Leoleos, who is senior threat intelligence researcher at Arctic Wolf, where he keeps a watchful eye on the latest threats and threat actors to understand the potential impact on the Arctic Wolf customers. He has 8 years of experience in many areas of the cybersecurity, and he holds a bachelor degree in IS. Sam Ghannad, who is the senior security researcher at Arctic Wolf, he goes down to the rabbit hole to understand the vulnerabilities and malware to make sure that our customers are safe. He has 9 years of experience in many areas of the cybersecurity. He also has a bachelor degree of computer science and certified on ASCP. Thanks, James and Samy, for taking the time and speaking with me today.
Oh, thank you for having us, Sule.
Of course. All right, fantastic. So today we have a really packed agenda. What we are going to do is we are going to try to understand the Spring4Shell vulnerability, and then we are going to compare Log4Shell and Spring4Shell. We will do a deep dive on the POC, and then we will talk about the article of Spring4Shell Deep Scanning tool and how we can run this deep scanning tool script. We will walk you guys through how Arctic Wolf responds to this, vulnerability and what is the value Arctic Wolf can, provide. With that, I am just going to ask the very first question that everybody just thinks, James, would you please tell us about this Spring4Shell vulnerability?
Yeah, for sure. So first thing to get started is obviously we want to understand what is the Spring framework and what is the Spring4Shell vulnerability. So the Spring MVC framework allows developers to focus mainly on the core business logic of their applications as they're developing them. And this simplifies the development cycle of Java enterprise applications. So with that being said, it's safe to assume that this framework could be used or spread out throughout many different Java applications out there in the wild. Um, this all started off as a 0-day vulnerability. So it was first reported to VMware late last Tuesday evening. I believe that was March 29. And it was disclosed by a couple of security researchers from the Ant Group FG. Spring4Shell is a critical remote code execution vulnerability in the Spring framework. The vulnerability impacts both Spring MVC and the Spring WebFlux applications running JDK 9 and above. So we first saw that POC exploit code was made publicly available for this on Twitter by a couple of different security researchers last Wednesday. So that would have been March 30th. And as soon as we saw that, we jumped right on it. We grabbed the exploit code because we wanted to start performing our own analysis. At the time, there was a lot of confusion going on out there. On Twitter, some people were saying that this wasn't a vulnerability or that the exploit code was not real. Others were saying that it was. So we wanted to perform the analysis ourselves to better understand what was going on there and if it was real or not. And Samy will go into a little bit of a deeper dive on that later on in the webinar.
Mm-hmm.
So while we were performing that analysis, the very next day on March 31st, Spring came out and they published a security advisory confirming Spring4Shell that it was a true vulnerability. And on the same day, they released a couple of patches for it for the Spring framework. So these would be versions 5.3.18 and 5.2.20. So those versions were released to address this vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Now, although there is a patch out there for Spring4Shell, for our customers to actually use that, they would need the vendors of their applications to apply those patches on their end.
Mm-hmm.
If a customer has their own custom Java applications internally built using the Spring framework, then they could apply these patches to remediate immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we're kind of waiting for vendors to release their own advisories and their own patches for this if they're affected by Spring4Shell. And
Mm-hmm.
then finally, on that same day, a CVE number was finally assigned to Spring4Shell.
Finally.
Yeah, and that was CVE 2022 22965.
Mhm. Fantastic. And there are a little bit confusion within the industry regarding to Spring4Shell. There are like, how many do we have Spring4Shell vulnerability at the moment?
Yeah, so there was already confusion about if Spring4Shell was real or not. And then to
Mhm.
just add to that confusion, there was another vulnerability, similar vulnerability that came out within like I think a day or two prior,
Mhm.
and that was for the Spring Cloud function. So we wanted to make it clear that there is only one Spring4Shell vulnerability, and that is what we just discussed, CVE 2022 22965. However, there is a separate vulnerability affecting the Spring Cloud function, and that is, CVE 22963. So that CVE is a vulnerability that could lead to remote code execution and access to local resources in the Spring Cloud function for versions 3.1.6, 3.2.2, and older unsupported versions if successfully exploited. We have not observed active exploitation of this separate CVE at this time. However, we have observed multiple POC exploits being shared publicly for this one. And at the time that it was released, the CVE was assigned a medium severity score,
Mhm.
but however was quickly upgraded to critical severity by VMware
Mhm.
once the remote code execution aspect of the CVE was better understood.
Mhm. Fantastic. So, couple months ago, back in December 2021, there was a huge vulnerability that basically hijacked the entire cybersecurity industry, which was Log4Shell. We sometimes people go by the Log4j because that was the library name. So how can we compare Log4Shell to the Spring4Shell? Can you guys chime in here?
Yeah, so with Spring4Shell, when it first came out, a lot of similarities were drawn to Log4Shell. As you mentioned, Log4Shell was a major vulnerability event that took place towards the end of 2021. And
Mhm.
so when looking at the similarities between the two, we can see that both are remote code execution vulnerabilities that are related to Java, with the Spring Core framework being a commonly used framework in Java applications. And this is similar to how, Log4j is a commonly used logging library with Java within Java applications. Um, with Log4Shell, there were a lot of vendors that put out advisories outlining their exposure as to whether they were impacted with their products, and this process took anywhere from like weeks to months for them to discover if their product was vulnerable. We suspect that vendors right now are doing something similar by like scrambling to identify the impact of Spring4Shell to their applications, and we expect them to probably continue to assess this for the weeks to come. So with that being said, there are a couple of security researchers that have created GitHub pages now where they are tracking vendor advisories as they come out with new updates in regards to whether or not their applications are vulnerable to Spring4Shell. So something good to just kind of keep an eye on as things progress, with this whole event.
Mhm.
Now, onto some of the more differences between the two. The Spring Framework is a commercial product, and so with that being said, the hope is that there will be more clear indicators as to where and when it has been used. Um, with Log4Shell, when it first came out, it was confirmed to impact a large amount of applications across the internet early on,
Mhm.
and we saw that exploitation began almost immediately
Yeah.
after disclosure with Log4Shell. Now, with Spring4Shell, it is believed to impact a large amount of applications. However, we have only observed scanning activity thus far.
Mhm.
It appears that threat actors are still trying to figure out how to exploit this and which
Mhm.
applications they can target. And so in the future, we may see campaigns exploiting this vulnerability at a larger scale. We're just not seeing that yet, but
Mhm.
in the future, we could.
Mhm. Fantastic. With that, I think we can move to the technical deep dive of the POC. So, Sam, why don't you tell us about this?
Yeah, sure. So let's take a look. Let's first take a look at what we need to be. What are the requirements and prerequisites for this vulnerability to exist on your system, right? So the first thing is that you must have JDK 9 or higher, and then you must have Apache Tomcat, and then your application must be packaged as var, and your application must have a dependency on vulnerable versions of Spring, WebMVC, or Webflux, right? Um, I put some like small asterisks there. It's like fine prints. Those are very important. That's why you always should read the fine prints in the contracts, right? So there are two more items down below that your application must be using non-basic parameter binding, and there are some warnings in the documentations that should have been ignored when we were developing those applications.
Mhm.
So it's very important to note that we are talking about this specific POC here, right? These are the requirements for this POC. So, for example, Apache Tomcat is something that this exploit, this POC, is using, right? So, I wouldn't be surprised if we see this one to be exploitable with different web, like different servers too, right? Same as for the VAR package.
Mhm.
There is well, some people might say, well, I've deployed my application in a jar extension. Am I vulnerable? Yes. Can be exploited at this moment? No, we don't have the current gadgets, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see new gadgets that can also exploit jar files. So
Mhm.
don't rule it out. Don't rule the whole thing out because you're not using you're just not using a bot, right? About that non-basic parameter binding. So quick intro to parameter binding is basically extracting values from an HTTP request and assigning it to an object. Am I wondering, does my application use it? I would say yes, it does. Well, I haven't seen the source code. How can I be so sure, right? So that's basically the M part in the MVC. If you're using any MVC framework, you have models, which are classes and objects, and you have controllers, which are working on those models, and you're probably accepting input and binding it to models. So yes, most applications are using non-basic parameter binding, unless they're just returning like static text. And that's
Mhm.
basically the whole web or everything that interacts with user input. There are some like some sources are also talking about the documentation that is mentioning that this binding is dangerous if you do not specify a list of allowed fields, right?
Mhm.
But yes and no. On paper, yes, and but there are still some nuances to that. You
Mhm.
may set a set of allowed fields globally, but
Mhm.
then each controller might override that. There is a possibility that they're overriding it. So the question is, like you can't rule it out by saying that I have set the allowed fields globally in my application. When applications get big and there are multiple people working on it, right? There might be some oversight. So the question is, am I using it everywhere, and am I using it with the correct um, correct values? Right?
Mhm.
That's not an easy question to answer. The best way is to patch. That's right now is the workaround. So there are some nuances. So the best way is to patch, not
Mhm.
workarounds. Can we
Mhm.
go to the next slide,
Yeah.
please?
Patch your vulnerabilities, people.
So
Sorry.
this is a sample exploit. No, we're good. This is a sample exploit that was leaked or published on GitHub. The most important line here is line 14. That's the actual payload that's being sent to the application and is creating the web shell on the application. There's like small parts of the payload are also in the header, but we can ignore that for now. The rest is just sending two HTTP requests. So let's just break down line 14 and understand what's happening there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So if you break that down, and I moved it a little bit around to make it more to help make it more sense. What this payload is doing is it's exploiting this vulnerability to reconfigure the access log valve object in Tomcat. That's why Tomcat was a necessary part for this POC to write a file in web apps/root. That's the path, and the file name is Tomcat var, and the extension is .jsp. So it writes a file in web apps/root Tomcat var.jsp, which can easily be changed, right? And the contents of that file are specified on line 6 to 13. That's what's written. That's what's going to be written inside that file, and that is a password-protected web shell that's like fully functional web shell, and the password is one letter J, right? There's a PWD parameter that you set it to J so you can get to the next part of the code, and there is a CMD parameter where you get to specify your command. And we can see it in action in the next slide. And that's what happens. This is the web shell that was uploaded by reconfiguring the access log valve object in Tomcat, and basically gives the attacker the ability to run any commands using the web shell. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so we do have a deep scan tool that you can use to assess your systems. It basically looks for all like jar and var and ear files, and gives you a list of all the applications that are vulnerable. It's application agnostic, and it's available on GitHub, open source, and free for everybody to use. We do have a demo of the script. So
Yeah,
if we can,
I am going to get into that, but before I would like to add a little bit more, color to this specific slide. So the Arctic Wolf Spring4Shell Deep Scanning tool delivered as a script, which is a complement, not a replacement to the other detection resources. So I would like to highlight that. This tool is, this script is really similar to Log4Shell Deep Scanning tool that we developed back in December to respond to the Log4Shell vulnerability. So I would like to make those clarification before we jump to the demo that you put it together. All right. With that, Kyle, we can run the demo now.
Using Arctic Wolf's Spring4Shell Deep Scan script is pretty easy. All we need to do is first to head out to this repo. Here we can see a README with all the background and how to interpret the scan result, how to use this script on Windows, Linux or Mac or any other supported platforms. So first we just need to click on the releases directory and then click on the zip file. Then we click download to download it to our disk. After it's downloaded to the disk, we just need to extract it. I'm going to extract this on desktop so I can easily find it. I'm going to extract it to a folder called scanner. Next, what we need to do is to open a PowerShell or a command line as administrator. We then change the directory to the folder where we extracted the scanner and run the following command. The scanner is now working in the background. All we need to do is wait. Okay, now it's done. And if you look at the folder where we extracted the scanner, we can see two files, a log file and a JSON. Log file is usually used for debugging. It has everything that the scanner has done, all the places that it looked at, And what we actually care about, is the JSON file. In the JSON file, under the vulnerable application path, we can see the applications that were found to be vulnerable.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Sam, for putting this together. So as you can see, this Arctic Wolf deep scanning tool enables you to remediate the exploitation, and it shows you which application has been affected and where the vulnerabilities exist. So with that, what I would like to do is I would like to show you how Arctic Wolf has been respond to the Spring4Shell, and we have some timestamps on that. So what we are going to do is we are just going to go through that timeline with you. So on March 30th, what we had is security researcher group publish a POC, which was unconfirmed vulnerability called Spring4Shell, which James walked you guys through in details. Within minutes, the Arctic Wolf Threads research team started to investigate this POC exploit code. Within hours, Arctic Wolf sent a security bulletin to customers, informing them that our team is looking into this alleged vulnerability, because at that time it wasn't confirmed, but we were already looking at the POC code. After that, on March 31st, Arctic Wolf's threat research team confirmed that POC exploits works under certain specific conditions that Sam just walked you through. In the meantime, Spring published a security advisory where they are confirming and releasing the patch for this vulnerability, and they assigned the CVE ID of CVE 2022 22965. On this very same day, Arctic Wolf confirmed that detections were in place for the malicious activities commonly used by the threat actors exploiting vulnerabilities such as Spring4Shell. And on parallel, Arctic Wolf started to develop a Spring4Shell deep scanning tool on March 31st. So what we did was we sent another security bulletin to our customers according to recent developments, and inform our customers that we are working on that deep scanning tool. On Friday, April 1st, within 2 days, the scanning tool was deployed and tested in representative environments to verify the effectiveness and consistency. And on Saturday morning, April 2nd, Arctic Wolf made the Spring4Shell deep scanning tool available on GitHub to public and the customers at the same time, which is super powerful in my opinion. On top of that, we have an Arctic Wolf managed risk solution, and that solution is able to detect this vulnerability as well within the solution, which is also super powerful. So our approach is to leverage your existing technology stack to gain broader visibility across your attack surface. It can be endpoint, network, cloud, identity, and human. So centralize all the data in our cloud-native security analytics platform, and we store and analyze it, enrich it, correlate it, investigate it 24/7. Our solutions are delivered using a concierge delivery model. This is an approach where we look at your environment, and we basically tailor our service and platforms according to your needs and your business requirement. We pair you with our team of security expertise who's not only monitoring the data, but also learning your organization's unique requirements. So that way we can understand and optimize our solutions for maximize effectiveness in your environment. We deliver our services across the entire security operation framework with managed detection and response, managed risk, and managed security awareness. With that, I think we might take one or two questions. We have about 6 minutes. So let me see. So can the Arctic Wolf deep scanning tool can be integrated centrally into infrastructure? If I'm not mistaken, answer is no, as we disclosed it on this slide. Let's see if I go back. Since we disclosed it in this slide, our deep scanning tool is there to support. It's not a replacement or replacement to the existing detection tools. So, but Samy or James, would you like to chime in here?
You're correct, Sule. So yes, it can only be run on individual suspected machines. Or
Fantastic. All right, let's see. We can go back to the. All right. With that, I think we can move to the. With that, I think we can wrap up. So, James and Samy, I really appreciate you guys being here and supporting and sharing your expertise on this topic.
Yeah, no, I want to thank you for having us, Sule. It's been a
Of
pleasure.
course. All right.
thanks, Sule. Thanks.
Of course. And thanks everyone for taking the time and dialing into this webinar. And we will see you next time.